Ever feel like you're, just glimpsing something huge, a really profound idea, but you just can't quite bring it into focus?
Yeah, like it's right there, but fuzzy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like you're missing that key piece to understand the whole picture.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's what we're trying to do here on the deep dive. Basically give you that crucial understanding, but without all the endless searching.
Cutting through the noise.
Right. And today, we're really laser focused on making sense of some, well, pretty fascinating and complex ideas. This is especially for you, the learner. You know who you are. Curious, you value your time, you love those aha moments.
And definitely don't want to feel overwhelmed.
Definitely not. We want to avoid that information overload.
And the material you've shared is, well, perfect for this. P.D. Ouspensky's Tertium Organum. Think of this book. It came out in the early 1900s. Think of it as this kind of mind-expanding bridge. It connects the world of hard science with these deeper metaphysical questions.
A bridge, I like that.
Yeah. Ouspensky was really trying to lay down a new way of thinking. And this was during a time of just massive scientific upheaval.
Absolutely, like Einstein and relativity.
Exactly. Relativity, the start of quantum physics. Things were really shaking up how people saw the universe. So our mission today really is to pull out the core insights from his exploration.
Okay.
Looking at reality's dimensions, how we perceive them, and the relationship between our everyday world and the, let's say, more fundamental reality he's digging into.
Right. And we know you listening might have all sorts of backgrounds, technical or not, but the aim is valuable insights for everyone.
Precisely.
Okay, so let's jump right into this whole dimension thing. Ouspensky asks us to imagine this creature, right, living in a totally flat, two-dimensional world.
Like Flatland.
Exactly like Flatland. How on earth would it even begin to grasp our three-dimensional reality?
It couldn't, really, not directly.
He points out that something as simple to us as an angle, like a corner, it wouldn't see it as a static shape. It would perceive it more like a movement, maybe, something changing over time.
Okay, yeah, like something passing through its reality.
And the actual purpose of the objects around it, totally beyond its comprehension. That really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What are we missing when we try to think about dimensions beyond our usual three?
That's the crux of it. The core insight is just how limited our perception might be purely based on the dimensions we live in.
And what's fascinating is how different that intuitive feeling is from, say, how math defines dimensions.
Oh, completely. Math uses exponents, powers, to label dimensions. X squared, x cubed.
Right.
But that doesn't give you that gut feeling, that sense of what a dimension is.
Not at all.
And Ouspensky brings in people like Kant, the philosopher.
Who really question the limits of our knowledge.
Exactly. And mathematicians like Lobachevsky, who worked on non-Euclidean geometry where parallel lines can meet.
Mind-bending stuff in itself.
It is. And their work leads to this huge question, this three-dimensionality we experience. Is it actually a property of the universe out there?
Sure.
Or is it something built into how our minds work, our perceiving apparatus, as Ouspensky might put it?
So the space we feel around us might actually be shaped by our minds.
That's the idea, a key insight, really. Our minds might be the architects of space as we know it.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me. The idea of a fourth dimension, and maybe even more. Ouspensky mentions this paper from 1911 by a Professor Umhoff.
Right, Umhoff. It shows that even back then, science wasn't just ignoring this. It was actively wrestling with the idea.
Because of all the new physics stuff happening.
Absolutely. Electromagnetic theory, Einstein, Minkowski on relativity. It was all pointing towards space and time being more interconnected, maybe part of a larger structure.
Like space-time.
Exactly, space-time. And this led to some genuinely paradigm-shifting concepts, like the idea that within a four-dimensional framework, past, present, and future might all exist simultaneously.
Whoa. Simultaneously.
Yeah.
Like all at once.
Yeah, the eternal now, it's sometimes called. Imagine your whole life's timeline not as something you move through, but as something laid out, existing all at once from a higher perspective.
That's hard to wrap my head around.
It is. And connecting this to the bigger picture, Ouspensky also talks about other attempts to grasp these higher dimensions.
Like what?
Well, he mentions accounts of occult experiences like those of Van Manen. He apparently even tried to draw a four-dimensional shape.
How would you even do that?
Exactly. And there are these rare descriptions of people having visions of fifth or sixth-dimensional forms.
Wow. What do they say they were like?
The descriptions often involve the sense of diversity and unity, like seeing how everything we perceive as separate is actually deeply interconnected.
Okay.
The analogy used is like seeing many different paths up a mountain, but realizing from the summit that they all lead to the same place. All peaks being one mountain.
I like that. So the insight is this hidden interconnectedness.
Yes, a potential for profound unity that our normal, everyday perception just completely hides from us.
Okay. So then Ouspensky shifts gears a bit, right?
Yeah.
He talks about different orders of phenomena.
Motion, life, and consciousness.
And he asks this really basic fundamental question. Which one comes first? Which is primary?
It's a deep one. He discusses how energy transforms, distinguishing between simple changes like water turning to steam,
Right.
and something more fundamental like the release of latent or hidden energy. Think atomic energy, maybe, though he was writing before that was fully understood.
Okay. And then he really challenges our basic ideas of matter and force.
He does. He asks, what if these things we think of as so solid and real matter, force, what if they aren't fundamental substances at all?
What else would they be?
Well, this raises that really crucial question about reality's fabric. Ouspensky quotes Madame Blavatsky, the theosophist.
What did she say?
She famously said matter might be such stuff as dreams are made on.
Wow. Like Shakespeare.
Very much so. It suggests that our concepts of solid matter and powerful forces might actually be, well, logical tools, concepts we've invented to try and make sense of everything.
Not things that exist independently out there.
Perhaps not. Maybe they're more like useful descriptions than fundamental building blocks. The key takeaway is really to question our deepest assumptions about what's real.
And this ties right into his discussion of space and time, doesn't it? He brings Kant back in here.
Heavily. Kant's idealism is central. Kant argued that space and time aren't just out there waiting for us to perceive them.
Right. He called them categories of our reason.
Exactly. Almost like built-in mental frameworks, software our minds use to organize and visualize the external world.
So the way we perceive space and time might actually be shaping the reality we experience.
That's the core idea. Think of wearing, green-tinted glasses. Everything looks green, right?
Yeah.
But the greenness is a property of the glass is your perceptual tool, not necessarily the world itself.
Okay, I get that analogy.
And what's really crucial to grasp here, according to this view, is that anything that doesn't fit into our built-in frameworks of space and time,
It just wouldn't exist for us.
it simply wouldn't register. It wouldn't be part of our experienced reality. Ouspensky also brings in the physicist Ernst Mach here.
What was Mach's point?
Mach observed that sometimes scientists get so wrapped up in their abstract math and theories that they kind of forget the original sensory experiences those theories are supposed to explain in the first place. They lose touch with the foundation.
Yeah, I can see that happening.
So the key insight is that our perception acts as this fundamental filter, determining what we can even experience and understand.
Okay, so if our perception is so central and potentially limited or biased, how do we get beyond that? How do we see more clearly?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Ouspensky explores the ideas of Charles Hinton here.
Hinton. What was his approach?
Hinton suggested that we might actually be able to actively change how we perceive the world, to train our perception in a way to get closer to the true essence of things.
Train our perception.
He emphasized the need to separate out our own self-elements.
Self-elements, you mean like our personal baggage, assumptions, viewpoints?
Exactly. All that stuff that colors how we see things. It's like trying to see a clear picture through a really dirty window. You've got to clean the window first, remove the self.
Okay.
Hinton used a great analogy. To truly understand the sun, we had to stop thinking about it revolving around the earth, around us.
Right. We had to get rid of that egocentric view.
Precisely. We needed to step outside our own perspective. Ouspensky also mentions Hinton used the cube.
The cube.
Yeah, the simple geometric cube, as a basic unit for studying arrangements and spatial relations. Because it's so simple and symmetrical, you can understand its parts and how they relate really clearly.
So the idea is simplification and removing bias.
That's the core of it. By focusing, simplifying, and actively trying to remove our own ingrained perspective, we can potentially gain clearer insights.
This seems to lead directly to that really key distinction Ouspensky makes. The phenomenal versus the noumenal.
Yes, absolutely crucial. The phenomenal is basically the world as it appears to us, what we perceive with our senses.
Okay, the appearance.
Right. And the noumenal is the underlying reality, the thing in itself, as Kant called it, that exists independent of our perception.
The reality behind the appearance.
Exactly. Ouspensky uses some good examples, like a book and its contents, or a coin and its purchasing power.
How do those illustrate it?
Well, someone focused only on the physical, the phenomenal Ouspensky, might call them positivist. They might look at the book and just see paper and ink. They might dismiss the story, the meaning, the contents as just abstract ideas.
Or see the coin just as a metal disc, ignoring its value.
Precisely. But Tertium Organum argues that these contents, this value, this noumenal aspect, it has a different kind of existence, a very real existence, just not a purely physical one.
So it's about levels of reality.
Yes. And Ouspensky, drawing heavily on Kant again, stresses that our senses are limited here. They only give us the phenomenal appearance, the surface level.
They can't directly grasp the noumenal world.
According to this view, no. The key insight is really what we experience isn't necessarily all that exists. There might be a much deeper reality underpinning everything.
Okay, these are pretty abstract concepts. Does he give us ways to visualize this?
He does. He uses some really vivid analogies to help us wrap our minds around it.
Good. Like what?
Well, he talks about imagining a flat two-dimensional plane intercepting a three-dimensional tree.
Okay.
A creature living only on that plane. As the tree trunk passes through, all it would see is a series of separate, unconnected oval or circular shapes appearing and disappearing.
Right, it wouldn't see the continuous trunk above and below.
Exactly. But we, from our higher three-dimensional perspective, can see that all those separate 2D shapes are actually just parts of one single continuous object, the tree trunk.
Ah, okay, so things that look separate in a lower dimension.
Can be unified and connected in a higher one. That's the core insight there.
That makes sense. Are there other analogies?
Yeah, he uses one from Leadbeater. Imagine someone just lightly touching a tabletop with their fingertips.
Okay.
Someone only feeling those points of contact might perceive them as several distinct, separate things touching the table. But someone who can see the whole hand knows immediately that those separate points are all connected, all part of one hand.
So again, limited perception obscures the underlying unity.
Exactly. It shows how limited perception can really hide the true interconnected nature of things. And then there's this really powerful idea,
Which is?
that maybe our entire three-dimensional world, the reality we live in, might itself be just a kind of projection, like a shadow.
A projection? Of what?
Of a higher four-dimensional reality that we can't directly perceive. Think about how a 3D object casts a 2D shadow.
Yeah, the shadow gives you some information, but it's flat, distorted.
Yeah.
It's not the real object.
Precisely. So maybe our 3D world is like that shadow. It gives us clues, but it's not the full picture of the higher dimensional object casting it.
That's a really provocative thought. And he keeps going, exploring motion and time.
Oh, yes. He digs into the nature of motion itself. He distinguishes between movement in space, walking across a room.
Standard motion.
Right. And what he calls movement in time, the way events seem to unfold one after another.
Okay.
He points out that our usual concept of time seems to bundle together two ideas. One is like a new kind of spatial extension, another dimension almost. And the other is the idea of motion along that new dimension. He even brings up Riemann, the mathematician.
What was Riemann's idea?
Riemann had this intriguing idea of basically translating time into space, thinking of temporal movement as if it were movement through a fourth spatial dimension.
So time becomes just another direction to move in.
In a manner of speaking, imagine a consciousness that isn't stuck like us, moving moment by moment. Now.
Yeah.
Imagine it could perceive all points in time, past, present, future, all laid out simultaneously, existing side by side.
Like seeing the whole film reel at once instead of frame by frame.
Exactly. A consciousness outside of our temporal limitations.
Which then, I guess, leads straight into that classic philosophical puzzle. Predestination versus free will.
It does. Ouspensky tackles this head on. He lays out the apparent contradiction. If the future is somehow already there, determined by the past.
Then where does our choice, our will, come in? Are we just puppets?
Right. But he offers a different perspective. He suggests that the past isn't just a fixed record of what did happen.
What else is it?
It also contains, in some sense, all the possibilities that could have happened but didn't.
Okay. Like branching paths not taken.
Exactly. And similarly, the future isn't just one fixed path laid out ahead. It's more like a realm of potentials, a range of possibilities.
That are influenced by our consciousness, our choices now.
That's the idea. So it's not necessarily as simple either. Both determinism, from the higher view, and free will, from our perspective within time, might be aspects of a more complex reality. It's about perspective.
That's a way to think about it.
Yeah.
He also talks about how a higher consciousness could see cause and effect differently, right?
Yes. A consciousness existing, say, above our plane of space-time. It could perceive connections that seem widely separated by time to us.
Like what sort of connections?
Well, things like the work you put in and the payment you eventually receive, or committing a crime and facing punishment years later, or even birth and death.
They'd seem connected, immediate.
From that higher vantage point, the cause and the effect might be seen as part of a single, unified event happening almost simultaneously, not stretched out over years like we experience it.
Wow. Okay. And he even has a take on the ether, that old physics concept.
He does. The ether was this idea of a medium filling space that light waves traveled through. Ouspensky offers a pretty unconventional take.
What is it?
Instead of seeing the ether as something in space, like air, he suggests maybe it's the surface itself, the surface of contact or interaction between two higher dimensional realities or bodies that we can't directly perceive.
Like the skin, where two different realms touch.
Kind of, yeah. A very abstract idea, but it fits his dimensional thinking.
And then comes this really radical idea that maybe our familiar 3D world is the illusion.
That's a big one. He introduces this concept, the Linga Sharira.
Linga Sharira, what's that?
He describes it as a kind of more fundamental body or form, maybe an energetic or four-dimensional structure that persists even as the physical matter of our bodies is constantly changing, atoms coming and going.
So something permanent behind the physical flux.
That's the idea. And the argument flips things around. He suggests it's actually our fleeting three-dimensional forms, the ones we see and touch that are relatively unreal and always changing.
Like temporary slices.
Exactly, like taking cross-sections through a more solid, real, four-dimensional object or life process. Only these underlying four-dimensional bodies or patterns, he suggests, are truly real and enduring.
And he mentions the philosopher Bergson here, too?
Yeah, noting Bergson's observation that science often focuses just on a time slice of the universe. It studies moments, snapshots, rather than the continuous flowing reality.
Okay. Does he give more analogies for understanding these higher dimensions? Because they're tricky.
He does. He circles back to Hinton's idea of paper triangles on a 2D plane.
Right, the triangle.
Imagine two triangles on a table. They might look different. Maybe one is flipped over relative to the other, but they're actually the same size and shape congruent.
Okay.
On the flat 2D plane, you might not be able to make them perfectly overlap. They seem irreconcilably different in orientation.
Right.
But if you lift one of them up into the third dimension, flip it over, and place it back down,
then they can be identical. You can superimpose them.
Exactly. So movement through a higher dimension resolves an apparent contradiction or difference in the lower dimension.
And he connects this to our world.
Yeah, suggesting that things that seem paradoxical or contradictory to us in our 3D experience might be resolved or unified from a 4D perspective. What looks like opposition here might be harmony there.
And the plane being and the angle again.
He revisits that too, yeah. To really hammer home the point that a creature stuck in a lower dimension perceives features of a higher dimension, like that static angle, as something happening over time, as motion or a temporal phenomenon.
Because it can only experience the slice passing through its world.
Precisely. And that rotating wheel with multicolored spokes is another great one.
Remind me of that one.
Imagine a wheel spinning, and the spokes are different colors. Now imagine an observer who can only perceive a single fixed point on the circumference where the spokes pass by.
Okay, like looking through a tiny slit.
Right. All that observer sees is a sequence of color changes appearing and disappearing at that one point. Red, then blue, then green.
They wouldn't see the wheel itself.
No, they'd have no concept of the rotating, multicolored wheel existing in the higher, in this case 2D dimension, that's causing the sequence of colors they observe on their 1D line. The cause and the full reality exist in a dimension they can't access.
Okay, that's a really clear illustration of limitations.
Yeah.
And this leads him to critique purely materialistic views.
Yes, a critique of what he often terms positivism, the view that only scientifically verifiable, observable phenomena are real.
How does he critique it?
He uses analogies again. Imagine someone from a vastly different culture. He uses the term savage, reflecting the language of his time. But let's just say someone unfamiliar with technology studying a pocket watch.
Okay.
They might figure out the gears, the springs, the mechanics, how it ticks.
But they'd miss the point.
Completely.
Yeah.
They wouldn't grasp its fundamental purpose telling time. They see the mechanism but miss the meaning.
Or the scientist analyzing paint pigments.
Right. Meticulously breaking down the chemical composition of the paint on a canvas.
while completely missing the artistic effect, the vision, the emotion the painter conveyed. Seeing the material, missing the art.
Exactly. He even describes the purely economic man, someone focused solely on production, consumption, material gain.
As a kind of two-dimensional being?
Yeah, living on a flat plane of existence, missing the vast depth and complexity of human life, consciousness, emotion, spirituality. It's a critique of overly simplistic models of reality.
So he argues life itself can't be reduced to just mechanics.
Definitely. He argues that life isn't just a super complex arrangement of mechanical forces because fundamentally biological phenomena and mechanical phenomena are just different. They're incommensurable. You can't fully translate one into the other.
You can't capture the essence of life with physics formulas alone.
That's his point. You can describe aspects, but you miss the core. He then speculates further.
What?
He proposes that maybe the phenomena we call life are actually a form of movement in a higher, unseen space. Maybe the fourth dimension.
Okay, so life is 4D motion.
Perhaps. And conversely, what we perceive as ordinary mechanical motion in our 3D world might just be a property of bodies that are actually motionless in that higher 4D space.
Whoa. That flips things around.
It really does. And he even takes it a step further, speculating about a possible fifth dimension.
A fifth. What happens there?
Well, maybe in the fifth dimension, even life phenomena become static properties like species, perhaps, seen as enduring forms, and only the phenomena of thought would still appear as a kind of movement.
So mechanics in 3D, life motion in 4D, thought motion in 5D.
Something along those lines. It's highly speculative, of course, but it follows the dimensional logic. And he strongly emphasizes that thought and energy are fundamentally different things.
Not just different aspects of the same thing.
Yeah. He sees them as distinct in their essence. He talks about the sort of shadowy quality of thought when we try to pin it down just by observing physical brain activity. You see the brain working, but you don't see the thought itself.
Right, you see the hardware, not the software running.
A good analogy. He then asserts pretty forcefully that our physical world, the one we experience day to day, is just a single section, a slice of a much, much vaster, infinitely more complex, and largely invisible world.
The noumenal world again.
Exactly, the world of causes, of deeper meanings. He uses the analogy of a street in a town.
How does that work?
You see the buildings, the pavement, the people walking by, the physical, phenomenal aspects.
Okay.
But you don't see the hidden currents, the desires, the thoughts, the plans, the secret connections, the histories, the dramas unfolding inside those buildings and people. That's the unseen noumenal life of the street.
Ah, the invisible reality making it what it is.
Precisely. He argues that because of this depth, everything has potentially an infinite variety of meanings and connections. So trying to arrive at one single, final, finite definition of truth about anything is impossible when dealing with this infinite complexity.
And our perception shapes what we see.
Absolutely. Our individual perception actively constructs the world we experience, which means other forms of consciousness, perhaps wider or deeper ones, might perceive connections or differences that are completely invisible to us. They might see things from over there, as he puts it, a different mode of perception.
Okay, that makes sense. And this leads him to talk about art.
Yes, it leads to a really interesting perspective on art. Ouspensky suggests that art, particularly great art, has this unique capacity.
What capacity?
To understand and represent the subtle, real differences and qualities between things that aren't physically or chemically apparent, the things science might miss.
The vibe of something, the essence.
Kind of, yeah. For a true artist, he suggests, the phenomenal world, the world of appearances, is just the raw material. It's the stuff they use to express something from the noumenal world, that deeper realm of meaning and causes.
So art is a window to the noumenal.
He practically calls it a form of clairvoyance, or even magic, a powerful way of perceiving and revealing the underlying reality that most people are blind to. He quotes Mabel Collins,
What's the quote?
saying that this earth is the scene of a drama of which we only perceive scattered portions, and in which the greater number of actors are invisible to us.
Wow, that paints a picture. He also talks about love and death, right?
He does. He observes that mystical traditions often focus intensely on death and the afterlife. but perhaps sometimes lack an equally deep understanding of the phenomenon of love.
Interesting observation.
And he challenges the purely materialistic view and even some spiritual views that see love only as a biological mechanism for procreation.
Just about making babies.
Right. He argues that the sheer force and pervasiveness of love in all its forms seems vastly greater than what's merely needed for species propagation.
So it must have another purpose.
He strongly suggests its primary purpose lies elsewhere, maybe in creative activity generally, or in establishing a kind of fundamental harmony in nature. He quotes Edward Carpenter's poetic phrase, the ocean of sex, to capture this sense of a vast underlying creative force.
Okay. Shifting focus inward now, what about the brain and consciousness? How does he see that relationship?
It's a key part of his argument against simple materialism. He suggests that from the standpoint of our inner life, our consciousness, the brain itself is actually part of the external world.
The brain is external to consciousness.
In a way, he uses the analogy of the brain as a kind of prism, or maybe a mirror.
A mirror.
Yeah. It reflects a part of our mind, a part of our consciousness, into the three-dimensional world we inhabit. It makes it manifest here.
Okay.
So if you damage the mirror, the physical brain naturally, the reflection, our experienced consciousness in this world will be affected, distorted, maybe even cease.
Right. Brain damage affects how we think and feel.
But, and this is crucial, damaging the mirror doesn't necessarily mean you've damaged the original object being reflected, the mind or consciousness itself existing on another level.
Okay. The reflection is broken, not the source.
That's the idea.
Mm-hmm.
He also critiques that old positivist thought experiment.
Which one?
The one where you imagine depriving a person of all sensory input from birth. The assumption is they'd be completely inert, just an automaton.
Because they have no external stimuli to react to.
Right. And positivists use this to argue we are just complex automatons driven solely by external input.
But Ouspensky disagrees.
Strongly. He counters by saying, look, if you admit there are two fundamental principles at play, let's say, thought and motion,
Okay.
then logically you could just as easily, maybe more easily, argue that thought is the single primary principle.
And motion.
Motion becomes an illusion or a property of thought, particularly within that concept of the eternal now, where all time exists at once. He does admit our everyday dualistic language struggles immensely to express this kind of unified idea.
Yeah, words seem inadequate for some of these concepts. He also talks about the inner life of wholes. What's that about?
It's the idea that the universe isn't just a random collection of separate things bumping into each other. It's more like a complex interplay, maybe even a battlefield, of opposing tendencies and forces. But he suggests there might be a kind of mental life of the whole, an overarching consciousness or intelligence that limits and coordinates these separate individual tendencies, like an orchestra conductor keeping all the instruments playing together.
And he even applies this to parts within a whole.
Yes. He speculates that maybe even individual parts, like our body organs, or even specific recurring thoughts or emotions might possess their own degree of being or life because they have distinct functions within the larger system, like little subpersonalities.
That's a strange thought. Organs having their own being.
It is, but it follows from the idea of nested consciousness. It expands into the notion that consciousness isn't just a human thing.
Right, that if intelligence exists at all.
It must exist in some form, in everything. Maybe manifested very differently, but present nonetheless. He really challenges our tendency to only recognize intelligence in beings that look and act like us.
Our anthropocentric bias.
Exactly. He pushes us to consider if there's a kind of vivid emotionality. He calls it a noumenon of emotions, manifesting in things we usually consider inanimate.
Like what?
Like the raw energy of electrical discharges, or the seemingly willful power of the wind. Could these be expressions of a non-human form of emotionality or consciousness?
And he even wonders if days have consciousness.
Yeah, he playfully throws that out there. Could Monday have a different feel or consciousness than Saturday? It's pushing the boundaries of how we think about where consciousness resides.
Okay. And he connects indivisibility with individuality. How does that work?
The idea is that something which appears indivisible or fundamental on our plane of reality might be a sign that it's a distinct individual entity on a higher plane.
Can you give an example?
Well, he brings back the linga sharira. A whole living organism seen across its entire lifespan might be considered as a single, indivisible, four-dimensional life stretched out through time. Our perception just sees a series of 3D snapshots of it. That whole 4D pattern is the true individual.
So my life from birth to death is one thing in 4D.
That's the kind of idea. And this leads him to suggest we might have multiple minds operating within us.
Multiple minds, like split personality.
Not quite like that, more like different levels. Maybe the mind of the physical body itself with its instincts and basic functions, then the mind of our everyday personality, our ego, and perhaps a higher mind connected to our whole life, our linga sharira.
And these minds don't communicate well.
Not usually, not on our current level of development, he suggests. They might operate somewhat independently.
And this applies to composite things too, like forests.
Yes, he asks that question directly. Is a forest just a word we use for a collection of trees, or does the forest itself possess some kind of unified soul or living essence, a group consciousness?
A forest soul.
He even connects this to folklore, like the idea of undines or water sprites being the souls or animating spirits of the aquatic element itself. The life activity of these composite beings seems different from the individual creatures within them.
Okay, and he brings in Fechner and the earth soul.
Right, Gustav Fechner. He had this monistic theology, the idea that reality is fundamentally one. Fechner proposed an earth soul, suggesting the planet itself has a consciousness, almost like a guardian angel for humanity collectively.
Wow. How did Fechner justify that?
He argued the structure of the universe is consistent throughout. Individual consciousnesses combine into higher ones. So you go from individual humans to the consciousness of the human race, maybe the animal kingdom as a whole, then the earth soul, then the solar system's consciousness, and so on, upwards.
Nested consciousness again.
Exactly. Ouspensky addresses the likely skepticism by pointing out that the Earth does perform functions like a brain receiving inputs, like sunlight, processing information, weather patterns, ecosystems, coordinating complex reactions across its surface. It's an analogy, but meant to challenge our assumptions.
Okay. So with all this complexity, where does Ouspensky land on the meaning of life?
It's surprisingly direct. He pushes back against explanations that place the meaning somewhere else, like in the distant future of mankind, or solely in an afterlife, or through endless reincarnation cycles.
So the meaning isn't out there or later?
No. He asserts the meaning of life is found right here, right now, and it consists fundamentally in knowledge.
Knowledge. Just learning stuff?
More than just facts. It's the knowledge gained through the entirety of experience. Understanding ourselves, understanding the universe. He even suggests our strongest drive, the root of curiosity, even the core of love, is this yearning for the unknown, the desire to know.
The meaning of life is to learn and understand through living.
That's a good summary of his position.
And he connects emotions to this idea of knowledge.
He does. He talks about emotional knowledge. He notes that our emotions are often tied to those different shifting eyes within us.
The subpersonalities again.
Yeah. And the significance of an emotion depends on which eye is feeling it. He suggests our everyday personal emotions, jealousy, vanity, fear, can actually get in the way of developing a stable, permanent sense of self, a core I.
They keep us fragmented.
Exactly. He again references Hinton's idea that gaining true knowledge involves a kind of gradual withdrawal from the purely self-centered viewpoint. Using Hinton's cube exercises, for instance, was meant to train consciousness to see beyond that limited pseudo-personal perspective.
So it's about evaluating things from a less selfish place.
Yes, from a perspective beyond your accidental I of this particular moment. He distinguishes between emotions that divide, like hate, fear, envy, and those that unite, like love, sympathy, compassion. And he links these to whether we're perceiving the purely material world or tapping into that deeper world of fantasy or imagination, the noumenal.
Okay, but can negative emotions ever be good?
He suggests they can if they're impersonal. For instance, a genuine hatred of injustice, not tied to personal slight, can actually be elevating and purifying. It connects you to a higher principle.
Oh, okay. So it's about the purity of the emotion.
Precisely. Impure emotions are those mixed up with too much self, too much ego. They cloud judgment. Pure emotions, being less entangled with the self, are more likely to lead to right knowledge, true understanding. He gives examples in lots of fields, science, art, craft, where overcoming the self element is crucial for genuine mastery.
And this connects to morality.
Yes. He defines morality not just as following rules, but as this harmonious coordination of your whole life, your actions, thoughts, feelings with your higher emotions and intellect.
Morality as harmony.
He even calls it a form of aesthetics, a sense of the beautiful, harmonious relationship between the parts and the whole. Immoral actions from this view are essentially uncoordinated, disharmonious, out of sync with a deeper understanding.
That's a different take on morality. He also critiques the way we use the word we, doesn't he?
He does. He critiques that modern split between the real world and the spiritual world, saying it leads to falseness in life. And he connects this to a lack of personal responsibility. We talk about societal problems, we need to fix this, but often don't feel individually accountable for creating or solving them. It diffuses responsibility. He questions if we is sometimes a false concept. Meaning the majority, operating from a lower level of understanding, might actually distort or destroy the valuable ideas or creations of a minority who have deeper insight. He uses a stark analogy.
Which is?
Apes imitating a human worker, but getting it all wrong, maybe even breaking things because they don't grasp the underlying purpose. It's a critique of blind imitation versus genuine understanding. He contrasts creation and destruction as signs of maybe two different races or levels of human development.
Okay. So how does he view science, philosophy, religion, art in terms of knowledge?
He sees them all as paths, different forms of seeking knowledge. Science uses observation, philosophy uses speculation, religion uses maybe emotional suggestion or faith, art uses intuition and representation.
Different methods.
Right. But he argues that true, deeper knowledge really begins when any of these fields start to manifest intuition.
Intuition. That direct sensing.
Yeah, the direct sensing of inner qualities, of underlying truths of the noumenal. He suggests that even the most complex intellectual systems might ultimately serve the purpose of raising us towards these higher forms of knowing, closer to the intuitive insights of art and true religion.
But he's critical of science's limitations.
He challenges the positivist claim that science just marches uniformly forward, conquering all unknowns. He says, look, there are vast regions, life, death, consciousness, the nature of time, that science has barely touched or fundamentally explained.
Things it can't easily measure.
Right. Science is great at analyzing the physical world, but it can't, for instance, directly know the thoughts of the person sitting next to you without them telling you. There's a fundamental limit.
So where is science limited?
He argues its sphere of exact knowledge is really tied to the world of our direct organic sensory experience. And real growth in objective knowledge would require an expansion of that very experience, something he feels science itself hasn't achieved. It works within our current sensory limits.
And he brings back the idea of matter as a condition.
Yes, reminding us to think of matter not as a fundamental substance, but maybe as a condition of our perception. Like blindness is a condition that limits sight. Our objective knowledge is bound by the conditions of our 3D world, space, and time because those are the conditions of our existence as perceivers.
It's all very interconnected. He mentions ecstatic knowledge.
Briefly, referencing Plotinus, describing it as seeing with something beyond reason, emerging with the divine where the sense of being a separate seer dissolves. A mystical state.
Okay. And the feeling of infinity, what does that signify for him?
He sees that sensation of infinity, which can be both awe-inspiring and terrifying, as a sign that we're touching the edge of a higher reality. A reality that our normal, finite mode of thinking can't contain.
Our logic breaks down.
Exactly. He discusses traditional logic, Aristotle, Bacon with its axioms like A is A and A cannot be not A.
Basic logic.
Right. But he argues this logic works primarily with concepts that can be neatly defined in words. What about things beyond words? And he says these axioms really only hold true for finite, stable things.
Not for infinite or flowing things.
Precisely. He suggests that maybe the mathematics of finite, static quantities is, in a way, unreal. While a mathematics of infinite and fluent magnitudes calculus hinted at this would be closer to reality's true nature.
And motion is linked to our imperfect senses.
Yes. He proposes again that our perception of motion arises because our sense of space is imperfect. If we had a more perfect, maybe four-dimensional space sense, we might see an object's entire life path as a single, constant, motionless form.
So our 3D world is a product of imperfect senses.
That's the radical conclusion. Our world, with its logic and its math, belongs to an imaginary section cut through the infinite universe by our limited perception.
So we need a new kind of logic, a noumenal logic.
That's what he argues for. A logic that goes beyond the phenomenal world. He suggests science needs to open up, to recognize that poetry, mysticism, art, these can be valid paths towards understanding the world of causes.
But it requires preparation.
Yes, inner preparation, faith, love qualities that help overcome the terror of infinity.
Terror of infinity.
That overwhelming feeling that can come with expanded consciousness, seeing light and dark, joy and terror all at once. He says this terror comes from losing our grip on the familiar everyday world, even though that world is ultimately unreal. It connects to the idea of being poor in spirit, letting go of attachments. He sees his Tertium Organum, third canon of thought, as following Aristotle's organon, logic for the phenomenal, and Bacon's Novum Organum, scientific method. It's meant as a key to this next level.
Discarding old ways of thinking.
Right, discarding our flat, two-dimensional idols of thought and trying, however imperfectly, to grasp the properties of this deeper world of causes.
And this higher logic seems absurd.
From our normal perspective, yes. He explains that in the realm of infinite magnitudes, things we take for granted break down. A might not be equal to itself in all contexts. A part could equal the whole. Different kinds of infinities can exist. Things that are mathematical nonsense in finite terms might be true there.
And the axiom A is both A and not A.
He puts that forward as a potential axiom of this higher logic. Utterly contradictory in our logic, but maybe reflecting how simple opposition or contraposition doesn't really exist in the world of causes. Everything is interconnected in complex ways. But he stresses these superlogical relations are incredibly hard, maybe impossible, to truly express in our language.
So describing the world of causes is difficult.
He says it's basically impossible to do accurately in words. He quotes the saying, "A thought expressed in words is a lie," meaning it's always a distortion when applied to ultimate reality.
So we have to speak conditionally.
Yes, using hints, symbols, analogies. Taking it too literally leads straight to absurdity and misunderstanding. The real truth, he insists, has to be found individually, internally.
And he connects this search to ancient wisdom.
Absolutely. He brings in the core teaching of the Hindu Upanishads. Tattvam Asi.
Thou art that.
Exactly. Explaining that refers to Brahman, the ultimate reality, the power behind the universe, and thou refers to Atman, the spark of the infinite within the individual, the soul.
So the individual soul is the universal reality.
That's the fundamental message. The unity of the knower and the known, the subject and the object. He sees this as the heart of what he calls psychological religion or theosophy. He connects it to Greek ideas too, like the Eleatics concept of one absolute being, and to the theme in many religions of the soul returning to God.
Even early Christianity.
He suggests early Christian thought, influenced by Neoplatonism, held this idea of the soul's inherent divinity, citing, "In him we live and move and have our being."
And we lost this awareness.
Through what Christianity calls sin, or what the Upanishads call avidya, ignorance, nescience, forgetting our true nature.
He also mentions William James, the psychologist.
Yeah, James's idea about the subconscious. James speculated that when people have religious experiences, that feeling of connecting to something more might actually be their conscious mind tapping into a wider subconscious continuation of their own mental life, like an iceberg, where the conscious part is just the tip.
So we're connected to a larger self.
Potentially. A self operating in a mystical or supernatural dimension, as James put it. And connecting with this unseen world is a real process with real effects.
And ancient texts might contain this higher logic.
Ouspensky suggests that when ancient philosophical or religious writings seem illogical or paradoxical to us, maybe they're not just being confusing. Maybe they're actually attempts to express truths using a different higher logic, trying to articulate things beyond our normal sensory world. He points to Plotinus's unintelligible beauty as an example.
Okay. He gives examples of people who had these illuminations.
He does. He mentions Jacob Boehme, the mystic, who had a vision of the being of all beings, seeing the interconnectedness of everything. St. Theognis talking about a hidden sacrament between God and the soul achieved through pure love and faith.
Others too.
Lao Tzu and Chuang-Tzu from Taoism talking about the Tao that's beyond words and senses and the paradoxes of wisdom. He references texts like the voice of the silence on achieving inner stillness, the soundless sound through intense focus and detachment, and light on the path.
What about light on the path?
About the need for deep inner transformation before you can truly perceive reality. You have to metaphorically kill out desire, the sense of being separate, the longing for easy answers, and instead desire the inner truth, the seemingly unattainable beyond.
Intense stuff. And Sufism, the mystical branch of Islam.
He explores Sufism, particularly highlighting its use of the language of love. He contrasts the Eastern tendency to harmonize sensual experience and religious feeling with the Western habit of often opposing the carnal and the spiritual. Sufi poets famously use the language, metaphors, and allegories of romantic love to express profound mystical and philosophical truths about the soul's relationship with the divine.
Using love poetry for a spiritual idea.
Exactly. He quotes the Persian poet Saadi on how truths are constantly being renewed, how ideas have their own lifespans.
And those moments outside of time?
He touches on that again, referencing a character in Dostoevsky's novels who experiences a feeling of no more time during an epileptic seizure. He links it to a story in the Quran about a moment stretching subjectively. But he also notes you don't need epilepsy or drugs for mystical states.
Right, so it all comes down to inner growth.
That seems to be his core message. These psychological or spiritual methods offer an answer to the immediate purpose of existence: to grow, to understand, to evolve inwardly. But he notes people often resist this. They cling to their existing ideas, their limitations, their comfort zones. He argues the future of humanity doesn't depend on just staying as we are, but on actively manifesting these higher, currently latent qualities through conscious inner work.
Like a child needing to grow up.
Exactly that analogy. Though he speculates maybe only a part of humanity is actually capable of or interested in this significant evolution.
And the rest.
Their fate, he suggests, might depend on the progress of the smaller, growing part. Because true inner growth leads to better understanding, which is the only basis for organizing life well, for solving our collective problems. Our current concept of humanity, he feels, is too vague, too undifferentiated.
He contrasts animal consciousness with human self-consciousness, too.
Right. He sees animals as largely immersed in consciousness, living in the present moment, but lacking our ability to step back and reflect on our own mental states as objects. That's self-consciousness.
Our ability to think about thinking.
Yes, which he sees as the basis for language and pretty much everything distinctly human. But then he introduces Dr. Buck's idea of a third level.
Cosmic consciousness.
Exactly. A state as far above ordinary self-consciousness as self-consciousness is above simple animal consciousness. Buck described it as involving a direct awareness of the cosmos as alive, profound intellectual insight, moral elevation, and a sense of immortality. Ouspensky respects Buck's work, but does gently suggest Buck's three-part division might be a bit too neat.
Okay, and the fall. The Adam and Eve story.
He discusses that ancient tradition, the loss of innocence, through gaining knowledge of good and evil, leading to shame, toil, separation. He connects it to the emergence of the concept of sin, but also to that recurring hope or conviction of eventual redemption through some inner savior or awakening.
And Buck himself had an experience of this.
A very dramatic one. Buck recounts suddenly feeling enveloped by a flame-colored cloud after reading poetry one evening. It was followed by intense intellectual illumination and overwhelming joy.
What did he learn or know in that state?
He described it as direct knowing. Knowing the cosmos is a living presence. Knowing the soul is immortal. Knowing everything is interconnected and ultimately working for good. Knowing love is the fundamental principle. And knowing, with certainty, that everyone will ultimately achieve happiness.
All in a flash.
In a few seconds, he said. He felt he learned more in that instant than in years of study, a direct, intuitive download of cosmic understanding.
How did Buck see this fitting into evolution?
Buck saw intellect evolving in stages. Simple reactivity, excitability, then sensation-forming percepts, basic sensory data, then combining percepts into recepts, like animal-level understanding, finally reaching the human conceptual mind. Abstract thought.
Okay.
And he argued that just as concepts are built on percepts, there must be a level above concepts, the level of direct intuitions. And that, for him, was cosmic consciousness, the next evolutionary step.
What are the key features Buck noted?
Well, first, the question. Is it real or delusion? Buck insisted the experience feels more real, more fundamental than ordinary consciousness. Then there's that immediate intellectual illumination, seeing the big picture, the meaning of the universe clearly.
And the sense of the cosmos as alive.
Yes, directly seeing and knowing the cosmos as a living presence. Feeling that individual humans are like tiny points of relative depth or limitation within an infinite ocean of life. And the absolute conviction of the eternity of all life and the soul.
Ouspensky agrees with all of Buck's conclusions.
Not entirely. He pushes back a bit on Buck's social optimism, the idea that society will automatically get better just because of material progress.
Ouspensky thinks change must be internal.
Yes. He insists that real positive change can only come from inner psychical transformation in individuals. Material progress alone is neutral, or even dangerous, if consciousness doesn't evolve alongside it. He also refines the idea of cosmic consciousness itself. He suggests it's not just a mix of high intellect and noble emotion, but the result of that fusion, something qualitatively different, beyond both intellect and emotion as we normally experience them.
A new state altogether.
Right. And he finishes with this idea of a new, higher race emerging.
A higher race. That sounds tricky.
He's not talking biology or ethnicity. He means a group emerging from humanity based on a fundamentally new, more comprehensive understanding of the world and life, a higher level of consciousness.
And this state can't be fake.
He believes it would be inherently resistant to falsification or imitation. You either have the understanding or you don't. He suggests people approaching this transition are already starting to recognize each other.
And this could solve world problems.
He speculates that our big social and political issues, which seem intractable now, might actually be resolved on a completely different plane from the perspective of this higher understanding. And he makes that fascinating connection to the Apostle Paul.
About sanctity in space.
Yeah. Paul linking spiritual attainment, sanctity with knowledge, specifically with comprehending breadth and length and depth and height. In other words, space.
So spiritual growth involves a new understanding of space itself.
That's the surprising mind-bending implication Ouspensky leaves us with, that developing spiritually might literally change how we perceive the fundamental structure of reality.
Wow. Okay. That is a lot to take in.
It absolutely is. But this whole exploration really offers a completely different lens, doesn't it? A different way to view ourselves, the universe. And hopefully for you, the learner listening today, it sparked some of those aha moments we talked about.
Definitely. These are undeniably complex ideas, maybe even mind-expanding, which knowing your curiosity is probably exactly what you're looking for. So maybe the final thought to leave you with, to sort of mull over, is this. In what ways might your own current perception, right now, be actively shaping the reality you experience, maybe in ways you haven't even considered?
Yeah, and what unseen dimensions, perhaps within yourself, perhaps in the wider universe, might be subtly influencing your life, operating just beyond the reach of your ordinary senses.
It's definitely a lot to contemplate. Really encourage you to keep exploring these fascinating and sometimes challenging concepts.